This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we return to fan questions and explore pet peeves, the core of PvP, and the true goal of play. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Touching the screen. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition, Dungeons & Dragons, as well as other tabletop scenarios, and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
And we're going to kick things off now in episode 101. We're in 3 digits now. Revisiting some questions that we had started last time. There were questions for for like player-based questions or DM-based questions, and then we ended off with questions for us specifically, and those might go into some really deep discussions and some deep dives, so we wanted to have our own episode to explore those. So we've dubbed these questions for the crew. We're the crew of this, the good ship Lollipop. Now, we'll go in the same format. I'll start with a question. We'll have some discussion, and I think we might have some specific answers for ourselves, but we'll get into it. So right out of the gate, what has been your favorite session you've ever run or been a part of? And this could be a both if we want. I have stuff to talk about if you're okay with me starting. So I will play things that I am really happy with and that I've been running. There's a long list. Many of them live in Grey Owls, but it's a lot of moments where the resistance disappeared. And we've had a lot of those in Grey Owls, but especially all my Feywild sessions and all my Shadowfell sessions, there's very low resistance to the flow of how everything comes through. But if I had to pick one right now, it would be the most recent time that I have been able to run a game, and that would be yesterday, which was on a Saturday, and I got to do a physically distant game. Whereas opposed to running it in Roll20, we set ourselves up with proper distancing. A lot of like switching between wearing masks and then being at appropriate distance, and then being able to take them off and actually act and look at each other's faces and stuff. But anytime we needed to move things on the map, we just put a mask on. It was a different way of doing things, but since these protocols are already cemented in our daily lives by this point, we kind of just adapted with them. It wasn't annoying, and we worked around making sure that we were always being safe. And then how do we just have a positive experience? And the game was the Monarchies of Mal, which is the Pugmire other side of it, where you get to all play as cats. And I specifically made shenanigans, things for them to just interact with. Yes, there was an end goal. There might be combat, but Pugmire and Mao especially are not combat heavy, not really built to be combat heavy games. They have combat systems because they're based on 5e. They're based on the open source SRD. However, it's more about the narrative, collaborative story. Even initiative is you roll for whoever goes first, but then they pick who goes next, and that includes the GM in that cycle. So the GM goes, and then they pick who goes next and what makes the most appropriate story. They also have inspiration that's a joint pool of inspiration. Like I have a little dog bowl that's full of inspiration tokens, and they can choose to spend it as a group to re-roll things, or they spend a larger amount of it and they describe how it just succeeds in a cool way. And there's a give and take to that narrative storytelling. And once we prefaced all of that at the start, the flow of everything was extremely satisfying because we were telling a collective story. So if something hilarious happened, we just went with it. And I would give them a chip if they just kind of went with this strange happenstance. And then they give me a chip if they really enjoyed something. And I can use that to be like, in initiative, I go now. Because you do have a tendency in combat, if you can pick who goes first, the bad guys always go last. But my red chips can say, I'm going now. And then I get to upset the order. But then when my turn's done, I still pick a player to go. And it's a really interesting dynamic that was wholly satisfying, really enjoyable, and just full of laughter. We were having a splendid time, all like collectively failing together. There was a lot of that. But that also made the triumphs, which are natural 20s, that much more amazing. And we got to have a really young player. We had an 8-year-old playing with us for the first time that they've ever played with us. And that made it extra cool to have this cute and fluffy adventure full of chaos and silliness. But I did this for someone's birthday, and it was absolutely wonderful. One, to return to this physical space to some degree, just to be able to be in maybe like the backyard with everyone else. It was really cool. And then to all of us buy into, this is going to be shenanigan filled. We're going to go toward the rule of cool, the rule of fun, for all of these things that we resolve, and even in combat. And it was wonderful to run it.
Yeah. You mentioned a few things there that are really cool to unpack. So the first being, and I noticed this teaching martial arts when we first were, we're having a gradual reopening where, like, students, they have to register online in advance to like show up to make sure that, we don't have to turn anyone away at the door, because we can only allow so many people into the training space at a time. But when you start teaching people in person, after you've gotten used to just seeing them over a webcam, it almost feels like drinking Mountain Dew for the first time, where it's like just like a blast of energy, and you're just like, right? And it's almost like you haven't built up a tolerance to it, where like it's so, having that energy in person is just so exciting and overwhelming. It really is a super cool thing when you're able to do it, and when you're able to find a structure that's safe, And the other thing that you said that I really, I've been meditating on for the past few days is, I recently watched a video on YouTube by WASD20, which is with Nate. And one of the videos he released recently was 6 things he doesn't like about 5th edition. And, it's one of those things where he even said in the video, 5th edition is his game of choice. That doesn't mean that there aren't aspects of the system that he would prefer to explore in a different way, or he's not critical of, right? And to me, I find, especially the way we've been running our games, being critical a little bit of the thing that you love allows you to find a way to find even more love for it, So, and the thing here is this the best system to run what you want, And like what you were saying with Pugmire, Adam, is perfect. You identify up front, Pugmire is a system that's not about combat. Combat is a component of it, but it's really about telling awesome stories with your pets, and kind of seeing your pets' perspectives of everything. So if we agree on, these are the best rules to satisfy the best experience we want, now all of a sudden that's going to align for a much more immersive and satisfying experience, right? It's kind of like when I wanted to run Mechton. I wanted to run a Gundam RPG. 5th edition wasn't appropriate. Mechton as a base system also wasn't appropriate, because there was a lot of unnecessary mechanics that would take away from the storytelling. So what mechanics do you keep? What mechanics do you change in order to kind of fit the experience you want? So one of the things that Nate had said is that, and this was 3 out of his 6 bullet points, where just D&D is not gritty enough for the experience that he wants to deliver right now. That means 5th edition probably isn't like, you might try like Zweihander or something like that, Right. That's like a system that's designed to deliver the experience that you're going for. And I found that to be a really helpful way to kind of frame it, because again, as the dungeon master, your goal is to create the habits in your players that you want to see and discourage the habits that you don't. So if you're one that's uncomfortable with players being rules lawyers, how do you set up a system that discourages them from rules lawyering, So yeah, I just thought that was a really neat way to kind of tie those two thoughts together. Just, the strengths and weaknesses of each system and how you can do little things to complement those weaknesses to produce an experience that everyone can enjoy.
And this was the appropriate player group for this, especially. These are all people that buy into the story-driven element whenever I play a game with them. And almost like doing damage isn't their reward. It's, oh, I knock him over here and he slides across the grease pile and knocks over this thing, and then this thing gets knocked over, and that's the reward. It's the narrative story. That's the reward for whatever their action was.
Beautiful thing to identify and recognize, like what is actually rewarding your players. So like for me, a lot of times in Geras, if I say like you're playing your character Fennec, right, Adam? Yeah. And I'm like, your silver sword deals double damage. Like as a math guy, like you said, I've quantified the reward. For players that might like more acting or storytelling, giving them the opportunity to use a funny voice, that's the reward of playing, Yeah. I just remember in game design, they talk about in RPGs, a lot of players, they didn't care about the game. They cared about getting to the next part of the story. Mm-hmm. Being able to see where it goes is the reward, not maximizing your damage or getting the best armor or anything.
I think it's interesting that we recognize that kind of thing right now because if we look at a few years ago when Undertale came out, Undertale was such an interesting, it wasn't like revolutionary or anything like that. It wasn't like super innovative, but the way it presented its story allowed for players to make different choices that would have a strong impact on the rest of the game that they play. So what was cool about it is that you had 3 different pathways you could choose. You could choose the neutral pathway, which was generally like you kill some of the monsters, you save some of the others. It's not a big deal. There's the true pacifist ending, which is where you spare all of them. And that's like the most story-laden pathway where you learn pretty much everything. Actually, not everything, but almost everything you need to know about the game and what kind of story it's telling. And then there's the genocide route, which is where you kill everything. It's the shortest pathway.
Spoiler
alert. Yeah. Well, that's how you do it if you're wondering.
Oh, yeah.
It's the shortest pathway, but you get to see the dark side of what you could be as a player because your character is an embodiment of your mentality as a video gamer. At least that's how I've interpreted it and how Toby Fox has generally come across when he's talked about it. And so for me, it's interesting when we talk about these things about what kind of rewards you're giving your players because they might want a more story-heavy campaign that is more role-play or exploration and not so much on the combat. And as a DM, it's important to recognize when and when not to take those paths. The other way is that it's actually kind of ironic because the combat in D&D takes the longest, whereas the storytelling, you probably accomplish a lot more storytelling in the same amount of time it would take you to go through 3 rounds of combat.
There were 2 specific instances of running MAU yesterday where my D&D brain kicked in, and I was like, oh, I could roll initiative here, but wouldn't it be 1, faster, and 2, more fun if we just told it like a story?
Yeah.
And instead there might be skill checks, but we're not going to slow things down as action, whatever, for what we're going to do here. They were on chocobos, essentially, with big like 3x3 platforms tied to the back of them, and they're balancing while mice are shooting webbing in balloons across them. They're in like a carnival race thing, like a Ninja Warrior thing. And there's a point where one of the chocobos got splattered with the webbing, but stuck to a different chocobo. And I did that because they made similar rolls and they were right next to each other. So they veered and then stuck to each other. And this is getting frenetic and crazy. And we could roll initiative here, but why? Because they're all buying into it anyway. Oh, which one does it kind of like, does one chocobo like lift the other one up and keep going? Like, let me roll for the chocobo. Natural 20. Lifts other chocobo up and is now carrying both groups as they spiral forward. That's silly and fun. And we don't need to break it down mechanically because we've already established this is about the story and the fun narrative that we're making together. So let's roll with it.
Yeah,
That's
no,
eventually
and that the reason this I've been thinking in terms of what system is going to be the most appropriate. That's a brilliant example of combat in 5th edition. The initiative system is a system that's appropriate for delivering certain kinds of experiences. This one, like, this system was inappropriate for this experience, so we're not going to do it. Like, if I really trace it back, the thing that got me started on this thought process was the Karama Eld finale for Night Owls, where we disregarded all of the mechanics of 5th edition. We didn't do die rolling. We didn't do combat. We didn't do turn. We did turn order, but we didn't do action economy. It was like, it was completely about the story because that's what we cared about, you know?
It's actually kind of funny because that reminds me of that episode of Community. I think it was in like the last season or something, where they played D&D, and I'm watching it for the first time, and I'm like, this isn't D&D, like, or at least not like the D&D I was used to. It wasn't 5th edition. I've never played any of the other editions, but I'm pretty sure it didn't work like that either.
It's a lot closer to 1st edition in the cruelty, but also they're bending because it's a different table.
Yeah, and it's a show. Like, the way you can't, we like watching, podcasts or whatever of people playing D&D because it's interesting to us. But like for a popular show like Community, it's a different audience. So you have to change it to make it look more interesting. But now that we're talking about it, I kind of would wonder what it would be like to just try that, like for a session, just do a one shot where it's like the player declares their action, the DM actually rolls to see how successful they are, and then describes, narratively what happens as a consequence. And it would require a lot more, in my eyes, commitment on the DM's part to have that creative flow, to be able to say, like, the bridge gives out under your weight, and then you fall to the bottom of the ravine into the river and you drift away or something like that with the rest of your party.
And actually, looking back on it, this is what made me think of the 4 quadrants of player personalities that we use, story to mechanics, and then, reactive to proactive. I don't know if you guys have read it, but there is an article by Richard Bartle, who was studying MUDs. So, and he was he identified 4 different personalities of players and really how you reward different players. So it's another tool set I just remembered, and I should integrate this when I teach DMs and all that stuff. Which is basically you have 4 quadrants where it's acting versus interacting, and then players versus world exploration. So it runs different axes than I presented, but it's also a very useful tool. So your 4 personalities are killers, achievers, socializers, and explorers. And it just identified what players tend to like to be rewarded with. So killer players, they like dominating other players, right? So even in a single player RPG, they like being the ones to have the maximum amount of points of damage so that they can show other players that they're better than them. Or it's like, Halo, like get the most kills and get the least deaths, So
the noobs.
Yeah, for like Dungeons and Dragons, like to reward players that are into that, you present more combat. You give them things to kill, And then you have achievers, which are more about collecting concrete measurements of their success. So they like experience points, levels, equipment, This is like Stephanie, right? So like Stephanie really likes being an achiever player. She likes collecting things, right? That a lot of times that it gives her a very concrete measurement of how well she's doing. You have socializers, which is more like the Gray Owls approach, right? Where they really like interacting. They like, they're more there for the relationships, and they're more there just for the experience. And then you have explorers, which are like finding secrets and uncovering things. And obviously, I don't think anyone fits in one box in particular. I can see myself being a little bit of all 4 of them, but maybe like towards one or another based on the session that I'm in, So like in Night Owls, I ended up being a socializer. I didn't mean to be. I came in ready to play combat, but that's what I wanted to be. When I was Solomon, I was more of a killer player. I wanted to kill the things well, better than anybody else. And also there was a little bit of that socializing element, but the achievement and the exploration was to aid like the killer part of it, you know? So most players will recognize the value of all four, but it's what do they feel rewarding in their behavior of the game. So I figured that was an interesting tool. If anybody just looks up Bartle player types, like it's a really good article for learning how to engage your players and energize them.
For my games, my favorite game that I've run is actually one of my Blood in the Valley sessions, which is a precursor to the Curse of Strahd that I kind of homebrewed, but used the same setting. And I was really happy with the session because it involved a deity that I had been building up for a long time and had made connections with all of the characters, basically, known as Mother Night. And she, in Curse of Strahd, you don't really hear too much about the deities, especially not Mother Night. There's not really too much to say about her. It's left very much up to interpretation, which is exactly what I did. So that session was really cool for me because I got to use a mechanic of combat where I had a horde of zombies, and there were about two ways that I could do it. The one way was to make it just one gargantuan zombie token that consisted of like 20 or 30 zombies, so to speak. And that would allow certain ways to flank it and other things like that. The other way, which I think I would have preferred doing in hindsight, was to do the combat completely in the theater of the mind without using the tokens at all. And by doing that, I would have to say there's a close range, a medium range, and a far range. And people have to, maneuver within those ranges in order to kill zombies. There would still be HP involved and AC and damage, but instead of having just this one big token, which kind of reduced the effect of like a horde, I would have just been showing the picture of the horde on Roll20, like I usually do.
Yeah.
And so this would have been really cool, and I kind of wish I did that. However, after the horde of zombies, I had one more thing come in, which was a Whispering Warlock, which, if anybody's interested, you can actually find it on the 5th edition SRD that's open source, not it's like a wiki, basically, where people make all sorts of things up, like spirit damage, whatever that is. I just interpret it as radiant. But anyways, the Whispering Warlock is cool because he has this mechanic that allows him to mark two different, or it's actually an AoE, kind of like Fairy Fire, where if you don't make the save, you go under the effects of the Magic Jar spell, which allows the Whispering Warlock to basically change the souls of two people or more in so that they basically become completely different characters. Now, this was really cool because what happened was the Barbarian and the Sorlock switched personalities completely. And I ruled it as you don't have access to all of the abilities because, you've never been a Barbarian before. You've never been a Sorlock before, but you have some of the basic stuff. And you're going to have to coordinate to talk to each other and figure out how to beat this guy, who can also fly, by the way. So it was one of the really cool moments. And I missed a slight opportunity. I know this is like my favorite one that I ran, but like there are so many things about it that get me excited. I missed an opportunity to make it so that they were basically cursed until they got a remove curse spell or something. Instead of just saying, okay, the spell's over because you killed the thing, it would have been really cool to say, you guys are still stuck in each other's bodies until you get it fixed, go see a doctor. Like it was
your arm's still broken. It doesn't go away just because you killed the thing that broke it.
Yeah, exactly. That would have been really neat. So I just wish I had done that. But that was one of my favorite sessions I ever ran. The favorite session I've been a part of was actually the first session of Grey Owls, where I debuted Rowan's build. That was really neat because I'd never been in a game where it was so interactive and roleplay-esque. Most of the time I've done Night Owls, which involves a lot more combat. But Gray Owls, I was like, well, I can't wait to try out my weapon thing. and I was just waiting, and I was like, I don't know if it's going to happen. I'm having a really awesome time. Like, it was one of my favorite experiences, especially because Adam took the time basically to go around the table. This is when we were meeting in person, to go around the table basically and talk to each person as what they wanted to do during this downtime. And that made me feel really special when he got to me. So I really like that. But yeah, those are my favorites.
It's so rare that I get to play in a game. I realize I went off on the tangent of the energy of running something. But a lot of this is really giving me a lot of thought about Gray Owl's book 2. And whereas before the reward for successive sessions was you leveled up because your level was the chapter number, but discovering especially with Gray Owls that's not the reward, really. It's the progression. It's like this is where you can see beginning, middle, and end of the campaign. But really your levels and your features, the mechanical abilities that show up, aren't necessarily the focal point, and they're not necessarily the reward. The reward is going to be the relationships you build. So that warms my soul that you were connected to that. But yeah, coming from Night Owls is combat heavy, and then like, well, I've got this cool combat build. I may not even get to use it this time around, like I said, in this session, but as long as we're having a good time, it's okay. But really putting it out there in the beginning, this is the framework of Gray Owls, and that's this, just setting up more expectations. In a game that I've been able to be in now, session 5, they hit a milestone. A friend of mine is running it, and they ran it initially for my birthday, and it was just supposed to be a one-shot. And we enjoyed the world so much that we've continued to meet, every month or two. And it's a point where I get to really cut loose and relax. That's what I wanted. But in that idea, it means everybody has relaxed. And though our DM, she has planned for possible emotional beats and really interesting encounters, we haven't really gotten there yet because we've been tooling around the town, interacting with everyone and causing chaos and shenanigans. And it feels like classic D&D, like really classic, where the memes are. We entered the town and this town got worse because we came here. Oops. We'll try to make amends. There are consequences to our actions. They make sense. Also, I'm a kobold. People look at me funny. Like that's what happens when you're monstrous races. And it's a really intriguing world. She did a very excellent job with making an interesting place. But we've all bought into that play of things might get a little silly, and we know that. We as players are aware of that, and we know that there will be consequences, but we're not going to feel punished for those things that we've done, which is a really good social contract that locked in there. But to bring it back to you, Ian, bringing Rowan into play also was she's a story heavy character. There's a deep backstory that rolls with Rowan. So you brought a character that had an excessive depth into the space, which helped also open the door, and it reinforces future play as legacy games. Take your characters from book 1 and do a thing as a way to sort of flesh those stories out. But it was really, really cool to see you go and even progress in that session. Go from quiet player, reserved for combat, for things, for I have an interaction, I have another interaction, I'm having weird visions and dreams, and something's going on here. And I did that purposely. I wanted you to come out into that. But the more I can do and help with that, I'm glad that was so rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely. It was one of my favorite sessions, and it really got me excited for the role play stories, because even in Night Owls, I was enjoying the role play that I had, and because there was so much combat, it made me covet that role play so much more, because Eld is so interactive with his patron. And so, Rowan is also a warlock. But it's a completely different patron, and I was really interested to see how that was going to play out. But I was also interested in what sort of relationships she might develop with the people that she met, because she was kind of introduced as somebody to greet the party as they are coming to this camp, this military base, basically. And then they're just like, you take Rowan with you. It's like, okay. I really liked everything about that session. There were some silly things like soup bath. I don't know what that was, but it was awesome.
It's classic D&D. Good D&D.
So, I think the favorite session that I've ever run, usually any sort of I haven't messed up a conclusion for a campaign yet. Probably just jinxed myself. But they usually end up pretty organic and call back to even the beginning of whatever the campaign was. But I think the one that sticks with me most is there was a game of Tyranny of Dragons that we ran where 3 of the characters had these prophetic visions, right? And they had gone to a temple and kind of went into these chambers, and they saw very different things. And it was something where not everybody was involved, but everybody was engaged. That everybody was at the table was very invested in the individual visions that these 3 characters had seen. And after we were done, one of our players commented, "You leveled up your game mastering." Looking back on it, I think it's that she was excited because we were playing a style that she liked. But what it did is it was the first time I could think back where it gave me as a dungeon master a lot of confidence in my ability as a storyteller. I was always confident in my ability to deliver an experience, but specifically narrating dramatic moments was always something that my players just never seemed really interested in. The players that I was playing with anyways. So in introducing this element, it was really cool because it allowed me to break out of a lot of habits that I had made for myself in order to start practicing this other side of dungeon mastering. And Adam was a part of this session. His character had a vision himself, and it was before like you just put in the chat. Before that, it was casual D&D, and this session was set up as a learning experience for people that had never played but they wanted to. And so a lot of the early adventures were very silly, and they just didn't have a lot of weight to them. And we had a lot of young players in that session as well. But as each of their schedules changed and we had more of an adult audience, it became a lot easier to tell mature stories with stronger emotional beats, because you wouldn't have to worry about entertaining the younger ones. In terms of a favorite session I've been a part of, for me, I had a lot of fun with Grey Owl's Chapter 12A. Solomon was a character that also, he had a lot of backstory that nobody cared to ever ask him about. And I was running him in 2 parallel campaigns. I was running him in Cloudsinger, which took place in a completely different timeline than Grey Owls. And a lot of the players knew that, wait a minute, you're playing literally the same character, but they're in 2 different ages. How does that work? But what ended up, a lot of times in character, their characters would just make assumptions about who he was and what his background was without ever asking him. And so I just patiently played him consistently for about a year and a half. And then all of a sudden, all of his backstory came out, and he ended up creating a lot of connections with other individuals that were that had originally kind of dismissed him as just a jerk. And, he's just he's not a very nice guy, and he's hiding something, which turns out he's not hiding anything. It's that nobody cares to just ask. So as a player, that was the session where I had the most payoff, where I had been patient for so long and it was killing me. but I had chosen to be patient, and it made the reveal that much more intense and that much more rewarding. And it was interesting because, like, you know, one of the, like, Matt Shepard's character is pure emotion, and Solomon is lack of emotion. And they ended up connecting more because even though personality-wise they were so different, their situation and circumstances were so similar. So, and Solomon had mentioned it earlier in the campaign where he's like, you know, hey, we're not so different, you and I. And what I got was, we're different. And it's like,
Yeah.
and 12A was where it was, we're not so different, you and I. Yeah, I know, I told you that 12 sessions ago. So it was, that to me, I think was my favorite session to run or be a part of.
That was a really interesting connective tissue, and already the party was huge. It was a moment where I think one of the NPCs basically put you in a room and then went, all right, this is what's happening, and everybody needs to get on the same page. And everybody got on the same page. And during that time, we got a whole bunch of sharing for everyone, psychic or not, for some of the mind readers in the party. But to see and watch, John did an excellent job of keeping Solomon consistent. And Solomon has playful moments, but they're very subdued. So in our most recent, you know, Team Bug close of Rails Book 1, you get to see a glimpse of Solomon without dampened emotions, Solomon. And suddenly it was a really wonderful moment of, we got used to, oh, this is just how Solomon is. No, remember, Solomon has dampened emotions, and he hasn't been able to express himself for years now, for years of play, as in the campaign. So, oops. And that was a brilliant thing. But 12A was really cool to run because it was 8 hours of talking. We hashed things out and figured out what one of the main threats might be and where our directions were, and it changed the entire campaign. And it was our first session without combat. That's when I started to slow down the progression just a little bit here and there. Like it would take, you know, 2 sessions to go to the next chapter to, you know, level up, so to speak. But it gave us license to interact, to explore and socially interact. And it didn't have to end in a combat. I was still running off of the Night Owls model of skirmish, encounter, final boss battle, you know, boss battle set piece, because that was always the format. But I that was the point where things really shifted, and shifted in a positive, satisfying way. It said, oh, this gives me license to do things like this.
All right. So our next question is, because we just ran 45 minutes on the first question. So the next question is, what is the most interesting or effective character build that you've encountered either as a player or a dungeon master?
Mine should be quick because the interesting character build, I don't know the specific numbers, and John, you might be able to help me. And it's Kiki. First time we encountered Kiki, run by our friend Stephanie. And Kiki showed up in Cloudsinger when Crag disappeared. And it was just a really interesting build because she had Raging, and I remember a Smite at one point, and then had Sneak Attack. So the build already had a lot of damage stacking and survivability. So Rogue 2, Barbarian 1, and then Paladin for most of it. But she tried a Sorcerer at one point. But I think even just Rogue, Barbarian, Paladin, you're going to get a lot of great things. And especially that Rogue Barbarian, you think about it, because Reckless. Reckless is going to give you advantage, and if you have advantage, you have Sneak Attack. And if you have resistance to things, then you have damage resistance, you now have survivability. If you have Paladin levels, you're getting a D10 for hit points. If you have Barbarian, you're getting a D12. And you have a nice spread of this build. Sneak Attack is huge. Smiting on top of Sneak Attack is huge. If you get that coveted natural 20, Sneak Attack, Smite, and your regular damage dice, yes, please. There's a lot that you can do to front load it, and she was just highly effective in not only replacing the sort of tank of the group, but in being also a very interesting personality, just really joyful and different, which is also great for a live play experience. But at any table that she ran, Kiki, it was just anytime I got to her turn or anytime I got to have Kiki interact with something was always joyful and interesting. And then the mechanics behind it were backed up very well. It worked so synergistically. I just sat back and went, yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. Continuing off of that, speaking of Smite, Rowan's build is one of my favorite builds that I've done for melee characters. I would say Eld is probably my favorite ranged character, but that just goes to show that I've only really played like 2 or 3 characters in my whole D&D career. So, but what was cool with Rowan's character is that it took me a little while to figure it out, but I finally landed on using Otherworldly Form as one of my Mystic Arcanum, Eldritch Smite as one of my invocations, and the Hexblade's Curse. So actually, on the last session of Grey Owls for Team Bug, I wrote out what my optimized attack patterns would be, what I open with, what I continue with, and what I end with. And so what was really cool about this is that with Hexblade Warlock, you can also get Banishing Smite. So this was a really powerful build when you actually hit. On top of that, I actually didn't use a feature that I didn't realize that I had, which was being able to knock things that are huge and smaller prone when I Eldritch Smite. That never happened because I just kind of forgot. But it was such a cool build because I would hit, and I could hit twice with Otherworldly Form, and on those hits I would stack Eldritch Smite with my highest level spell slots, and on a single turn I could blow 3 5th level spell slots, doing Banishing Smite as my bonus action and Eldritch Smite as my 2 attacks, and that would give me a grand total of, I think it was 12d8 for the Eldritch Smite, and Banishing Smite is like 5d10 or something, and on top of the 2d10 that I would be hitting with my weapon base damage, plus necrotic damage from another invocation, plus charisma damage or something. There was something like that. It was quite interesting how it worked out. Now, the only thing is that Rowan's build is only really effective as a melee fighter at higher levels. In the earlier levels, she's really dependent on Eldritch Blast, which is, the bread and butter of Warlocks. So to make this work, you really have to optimize your invocations, switch them out when you need to. I would say the threshold for Eldritch Smite damage is probably around level 15 or so, which is when I started her. Just because I think by that point, your Eldritch Blast is already 4 shots of Eldritch Blast. So it was a really cool build. I can't wait to try it again sometime and actually make use of the full pattern and not get stunned for 2 rounds before getting to hit more once. But it was still pretty cinematic, and I really loved it.
Yeah, there's a celebratory element to that spike damage, though. Instead of just, okay, I consistently put out 10, 10, 10, 10, but hitting once for 50 is nuts. Like, there's something so cool about landing that blow, where we've had the Night Owl season 3 finale where someone had a Starsteel Glaive, and it's the only thing that's hurting the avatar form of Cuse at that point, and then they crit a second time and had their brutal criticals on top of that with some smite damage, and they did crazy amounts of damage, and then we calculated it was 135 points of damage in just one strike. And the amount, like every single failure, every miss, every little damage tick before then is made up for by that one's boom spike damage, which pushed it into the second act of the fight. And it people seem to enjoy that. I think it's that ultimate adrenaline rush of getting that peak moment.
Yeah, and it's a better memory. Like, it's a very contained moment that's easy to kind of point out. My favorite build that I've run is Solomon's build. It's 1 level of monk, 2 levels of wizard, and the rest is rogue. Up until you can start, like, after rogue 12, you start building up monk to get to extra attack. So that one just ended up, it fit the play style I wanted. A lot of damage, a lot of knowledge. You have expertise in a lot of knowledge and perception checks and stuff like that. But the most interesting build I've encountered that is outside of, that I haven't gotten the chance to play, but I would like to, is Molotov's build from Grey Owls. So, which is really interesting because, like you said before, Adam, a lot of the features of Barbarian and Rogue synergize very well. So, and I personally, I probably would have built it a little differently, but for the story, it made sense the way that Patrick built it. So, with Barbarian, you have Bear Totem, so you have resistance to basically everything. You have Reckless Attack, so you can trigger your own sneak attack. You don't need other people to do that for you. And you've got Fast Movement, which is going to be doubled when you use Cunning Action, And then basically it was, I think Patrick did 7, but you can get away with doing only 5 Barbarian. And then when you go through Rogue, now all of a sudden, as a Barbarian, you can use either a short sword or a rapier as your finesse weapon, but you can also use a shield and combine that with the unarmored defense for Barbarian, right? So basically, you just prioritize strength, dex, and con, all the physical stats. You just kind of let the mental stats be. and you just sneak attack triggers with a finesse weapon, but you don't have to use your dex to trigger it. So you basically dump all of your attack power into strength, and you just go up and you poke the thing, right? So not only are you getting higher and higher sneak attack dice, but like you mentioned before, the reckless attack is going to trigger sneak attack. Eventually you get evasion when you go enough into rogue, so that, if DM tries an AoE attack, right, where they have to make a dex save, you're basically taking a quarter damage if you fail. And the likelihood of you failing is reduced because Barbarian has Danger Sense, which gives them advantage on all their dex saves anyway. So in the instance that you fail, you're only taking a quarter damage from most stuff. And by the time you hit Rogue 11, you get Reliable Talent. And as a rogue, you can get expertise in your athletics checks. So it basically means that the Barbarian is just unstoppable strength tank machine, So just it had decent damage output because of sneak attack. And the more magic item synergy you can get on it, it can be a real powerhouse. But to me, what made it so effective was its survivability, that, you're using the tough feat, using the extra ASI from Rogue. You have a high armor class because it's tied directly to Dex and Constitution. For me, I probably would have gone with more of a Dex Con build, so that, because you're using a finesse weapon for sneak attack anyway, you've got that, you're like got a really powerful attack bonus, damage output, survivability, which what more do you want out of your tank? So that's definitely been the most effective survivability build that I've come across yet.
So our next question is, what is your biggest player pet peeve? So this can be something that a player does that is particularly annoying, or just something you don't want at your table because of certain reasons. Adam, why don't you take it away?
This has gradients to it, and I understand both sides, because also I think I try not to do it, but I've had instances where I've done this, which is a player getting really excited about a spell, and then they cast the spell and they forget everything about what it does, or they have no concept about what it does. They go, I cast this. And then it's like, okay, what sort of save do I need to make? Oh, I don't know. Well, let's look it up. Let's do that. Oh, it's a spell attack. Oh, I need to roll. Like, not knowing how it resolves mechanically. So they can get really excited about casting the spell, but then they have no idea beyond, oh, that sounds cool, I cast Chill Touch. Or, oh, that sounds cool, I cast Disintegrate. And they roll a spell attack when it's a dex save. And it's like just not fully going through the steps. So whenever I prepare a spell, I'm playing a spellcaster, I've got my spell cards out or I have my book open and I've selected my possible things. But I know the information I need to give the GM. I cast this spell. It's a dex save, DC 14. And it's just, they need to make a dex save. Or it's a spell attack, and I roll the thing, I know what to add, and if it doesn't hit, okay, cool. But like, I know how it's going to resolve mechanically. And it's it's those little things that really, they add an extra layer of involvement to anyone who is a spellcaster. But they also allow, I think, a little bit more control, because it allows you to, even if you have to change, oh man, that happened, now I got to change to this new spell. Just being able, even if you have to look it up quickly, but being prepared, oh, I'm going to have to look it up. So you are already taking the book out and going, hold on, I just got to make sure I check. Okay, it's a dexterity saving throw, and this is my DC. That's already more efficient than, I don't know, because there are at least 300 spells in the player's handbook alone, and we've added several more. The GM shouldn't have them all memorized. They might have a few, but it's on your turn. You can also look those things up if you have the resource available. But the other one that pops up there are the ones that really throw the GM under the bus, which is, we've talked about it before, all the conjurations ones that are like, conjure animals, conjure woodland beings, conjure this thing, bring out a fiend. And it says stuff like, the DM will have a list available for you, which is so terrible in the middle of combat. I cast conjure woodland beings. DM, where's my list? It's like, what? Oh God, I didn't know you were going to do that.
It told me.
That adds a whole new layer to that the game just grinds to a halt. But the beginning of it, especially when you're learning the game, I totally get it. You can be really excited about, oh, I cast this spell, and maybe they didn't read that it takes 1 minute as opposed to one action. And like, oh, that's 10 rounds of combat. Like, oh, darn, now what do I do? And you can coach them through that. And so there's a learning opportunity there. But to help educate yourself too, it's when I have veteran players that have been playing spellcasters for a long time, and they'll get to one spot and go, I cast this spell, and then sit back and wait like they just pressed a button on a program. And let's just see the fireball resolve. We need more there. Luckily, we probably know what a fireball does. But there are others that are less general in that regard. And knowing how your spell resolves, one, it provides a really strong rapport between you and the GM. It also lets you know how this is going to resolve mechanically. If zaniness occurs, it occurs. That's cool. We can try to stretch the boundaries of it. That's okay, cool. But you need to know where those boundaries would begin before you cast the spell. Plus, it's really nice for me when I'm managing, say 6 combatants on top of the players, for you to be able to tell me, he needs to make a dexterity save, the DC's 15. And then I can roll for it and go, he succeeds, he fails, and then we resolve the spell. I really appreciate that. Plus, it shows that you've done some of your reading and a little bit of your prep. So you're learning the game better because you know what your spells are going to do.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest points of confusion is because a lot of people come to Dungeons and Dragons for the storytelling, that the spells will have a flavor text and they'll have a mechanics text. And to new players, they may think that because they've seen the community episode of Dungeons and Dragons, they can just describe what their spell does, and the DM will just know how to resolve that in game terms, right? So, like, and you'll see this with new players. Well, you'll ask, what does a fireball spell do? And they'll be like, it sends a tiny bead of fire to explode at a point I can see within range. Like, that they'll read the story stuff, but it's like, no, I need to know that it's a dex save or a con save, or is it how many damage dice are you rolling? Like, they don't think of that part because they think of that as the DM's territory. Where I find it the most empowering thing is to teach players how to differentiate story text and mechanics text, because story text can be changed. Mechanics text will upset the balance of the game. So, like my quick story on that was actually with a separate game, Magic the Gathering, where like you have the magic, like the game text, and then there'll be flavor text. And I was like 12 and I was teaching somebody else how to play, and I'm like, I cast Lava Axe. It deals 5 damage to you. And he says, I catch it. And I'm like, what do you mean? He says, well, if you look at the bottom of the card, it says catch. And it's like, you know, in the magic story, it's like some guy going, catch this. And like he gets hit with the lava axe. But like he interpreted that as I can just catch it and make it stop. And so like it's one of those things where it's good to, it's coming back to the example of, you know, it says I have iron fur, so swords can't hurt me. It's like, well, no, the iron fur justifies in story world the armor class calculation you have. My attack roll was more than your armor class. It still hurts you, you know? So it's finding that separation of what makes the game a game versus, and how do those game elements inform how we tell the story, not how do we make the game elements wrap around the story we're trying to tell. You know?
Yeah, there's like a literal interpretation that some players will go into when they read the flavor text. But I've seen it before. Like I need to know, like as the GM, and I've started to put this at the front of sessions. Hey, everybody, just as a reminder, when you cast your spells, I need to know the mechanical resolution for them, so that so I can resolve them. So when you cast them, just try to have a good idea of, is it a saving throw? What your DC is? If it's a spell attack, get ready to roll. You know, that if it affects multiple creatures, maybe tell me which creatures it's affecting. Just, you know, those little mechanical things. Because, and I've had it where a player will cast a spell and then they'll look at the book and begin reading the entire text of the spell, beginning to end. And now I am listening intently, going, where's the dex save? Where's the dex save? Where's the dex save? Where's the dex save? It's a con save. Okay, I'm going to roll my con now while they finish talking about the entire description of the spell. And that's just, they're going from the beginning to the end. I'm going to tell you everything the spell does, when it's an extra level of upgrading your level of understanding to be able to scan through that flavor text and go, dex. Or con saving throw. If they fail, this. If they succeed, this. And there you go. And the flavor's there wonderfully and beautifully and can be interpreted and all that, but the mechanical resolutions are also in there. So there's like a reading comprehension to that that I want the spellcaster players to kind of delve into and try to piece out the flavor text from the mechanical text. But sometimes they blend the two or forget the mechanics altogether and just go, this is the description of the spell. That's what happens. And like, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, didn't they warn us that reading comprehension was going to come up in life a lot more than we thought when we were in school? Like, I always, you know, you just never see it coming. But with the topic of conjuration, my biggest pet peeve is really, I discovered only recently, is just the spell conjure animals is just annoying. Like John has talked about it before, and I didn't really understand what he meant until it happened in my game.
Oh no.
And yeah, so it was in a one shot, thankfully, so we don't have to deal with that again. But basically, conjure animals allows you to conjure certain amounts of animals of varying different challenge ratings, and they have to be classified as beasts. And they're actually, what's cool about it is that they're actually fae, take the form of beasts, or something like that. And it's interesting because it gives the player, the optimal idea about conjure animals is it gives the player an option to summon something that will help them out in this fight, maybe tank a few hits or something, while they, you know, sneak around back or whatever. And that's cool. But the problem is the quantity of animals that you can summon. I think it goes up to 8 if they're a challenge rating of a quarter or lower, or quarter is the lowest, but, you know. And the size, there's some size options as well. So, like, I think you can summon one large creature or maybe a couple mediums, and then many small creatures or tiny creatures. So what happened in this game was my player decided, well, first of all, my player didn't know what the spell did. I was like, oh, you have conjure animals? Oh, make sure you know what you want when you actually use the spell. And she's like, yeah, I got it. Don't worry about it.
Oh, no.
I read what it says, she says. And I'm like, okay, sure. I conjure animals. All right. What do you conjure? And she's like, all right, let me take a look here. Oh. She only read the flavor text. So she's like, I'm like, all right, I'll come back to you. Yeah, I'm going to go around with everybody else's turns now. Just let me know when you know what you want to summon. She summons a plesiosaurus, which is a beast, apparently. All dinosaurs count as beasts, and it's large, and it was a challenge rating of 1 or something. And I'm like, okay. And she summons it, and I'm like, all right, what does it do? And she's like, I don't know. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? You just looked it up. Like, she's like, I didn't write it down. It's like, why? It's just the worst scenario. All the things went wrong. And so after that session, I was like, no more conjure animals. If you are going to conjure animals, you better know what you want to conjure.
There's a bit of that too. That's like the monster manual is usually, I say, coveted by the GM. It's just there are players that love the monster manual and will of course look at it and go, oh my gosh, I can't wait to face that thing. But when it comes to in play in real time of playing at the table, the monster manual isn't something that someone goes thump and starts going through looking for the beasts, because that's the DM will go, you encounter a thing, thump, here's the monster manual, let me look up the monster, and here we go. That's kind of like your realm in a lot of ways. So it kind of throws people off, even though the PHB has beasts in the back that you can actually look at. A lot of people don't know that. They go, they immediately think monster manual, not my problem. And so when they summon a thing, in a lot of ways, there are ways to kind of adapt it. John has mentioned before that, like, if you summon something in combat, you summon one thing, so that you're only adding like one more piece to the board. If it's, however, that also lends credence to, if you want to conjure animals, conjure woodland beings out of combat, there could be something really effective to conjuring a swarm of rats and having those things go do something, which doesn't have to be combat based. And if they summon something that you are in charge of those stats, that way I've whenever it's come up where I have a player summon something, sometimes it's random. Like in the Feywild, if they do conjure animals, by the way, it summons one thing and it's random what it is because it's the Feywild. And I have control of it. They can tell it to go do things, but I roll and it's those modifiers in front of me. If the kid is if the player is doing it, I'll have them just go, no, roll a d20 and I'll add the bat to it. Like I know that I'll have the stats, so you don't have to worry about that. And then if like that thing takes damage, I'll say, oh, it's looking kind of hurt, and it takes more damage. It goes out of existence. But then they're not sitting there tracking like a whole new character, because that's also the other thing. When people cast certain spells, there might be investment, and now extra investment with that. When they summon something, it's going to bring about a whole new spread of a character. You brought a whole new friend to come play with you, and instead the GM controls that whole new friend, it still allows the player to be their player, to be their character on their own. But now they can have a buddy. Says, hey, Gorilla Man, go punch that guy in the face, and then you can be the gorilla that goes and punches the thing in the face. But it's a different resolution. I totally get it. I've been there with that exact frustration of, why don't you know? But also, if they're thinking monster manual, that's way outside of the player's concept.
No, absolutely. And then and then it gets better, because then their conjured creature dies and they're like, all right, I cast it again. And it's like, why would you do this a second time when you've already seen what goes wrong? And you still haven't written down the stats. Like, it's just one of those things. But yeah, that's kind of my pet peeve. I'm sure I could come up with something else if I wanted to, but John, why don't you tell us about yours?
Yeah. So when this, part of the original question was, what is your biggest pet peeve, parentheses, we can take it. So get ready for some hurt feelings, because my biggest pet peeve, it's not even a pet peeve, it's I get angry, is when players are disrespectful at the table. And I'm just gonna say some examples, right?
Go for
The
it.
biggest one is when they snap at each other or they raise their voice. I can't stand that because it ruins the experience for everybody. So so anytime a player is like, you know, like, I know how to use my abilities, or stop helping, anything like that, it just it to me, that's like the most selfish action you can take, because now you are taking away the spirit of the game, which is having fun, relaxing, and storytelling, right? Other examples are the not knowing what you're doing, especially if somebody is like helped you before. So like, especially if you're a new player and everyone understands you're a new player, that's one thing. But it's another thing to like take away time from everybody else playing at the table, you know? So for me, as a player and as a DM, it's are you respecting everybody else's time, you know, and are you aware of everybody else at the table? So I find it very disrespectful when other players interrupt somebody else to be like, by the way, my character is leaning up against the wall. And it's like, great, was your detail worth cutting off this other person's moment? That's really what it's a transactional thing. One person speaks at a time, especially if you're online. Another thing is I've seen this where players are inappropriately loud, or they're harmful in some other way for the sake of their character, right? So I've seen that before too. It's like, well, my character would be this boisterous, and it's like, that's great for you. Again, pay attention to the people around you. Are you being considerate of everybody else? If everybody else at the table is uncomfortable, you are being disrespectful, right? So it's paying attention to that kind of stuff. Any mechanics, rulings, even if it's rules lawyering, a lot of times I can deal with that. But again, a lot of rules lawyering, the reason DMs don't like it is because it is, a lot of it comes across as disrespectful. Like any inclination of you don't know what you're doing as the DM, or you're not ruling it the right way, you know, you're setting a certain tone that's happening. So, which is why I don't mind rules lawyering. I don't mind when somebody is coming out, and even the your fun is wrong thing. Like, it's just the idea that, you know, are you establishing trust? And every single time as a player you're acting disrespectfully as a person, you're withdrawing that trust away, and you're limiting what kind of experience that everybody can have, right? And a lot of times you'll know that you've crossed the line with me because I'll just go, right, where the eyes get a little wide, and it's just like, you made a choice, like, and whether or not you were conscientious of that choice is a different thing. But that's my biggest pet peeve, is when you're like, when I find, and it, everybody's done it at some point, but it really does. And the other one that's disrespectful is not understanding the difference between like a person's character and a person's player. You know, if as a character, you know, they're being reasonably respectful in terms of, as a player, their delivery. Like if it's like Ian does something and I'm like, Ian, as a character, I'm like, Ian, you were an idiot, you know? And then all of a sudden it's like, John, how could you say that about me? You know, like that. A lot of times it's like, all right, I'm respecting your character and all their quirks. Why is it when I do my character and my quirks and I'm not stepping over a boundary, like it, all of a sudden it's not okay when I do it? You know, to me, that's also very selfish behavior, and it's very, again, disrespectful, you know? So I would say, as a player, just kind of pay attention to everyone around you, especially if you know that there's a player that's being a little quiet. In character, engage them, even if it's not what your character would do. If your character would do it, why would they do it? You know, that to me is a much more interesting like question to ask, because rather than my character wouldn't do that, that now limits what your character can do. So instead, if you ask yourself the question, if my character did that, why would they do it? Now, all of a sudden, that opens the possibility to express your character's personality in their unique way without withdrawing from the experience of everybody working together.
Hmm. It opens the door for their arc as well, or it might anyway. They could change. The next one is probably going to also get into that a similar territory of really getting into the nitty gritty, the tough stuff. What trope or scenario in D&D that is common, at least common in even in mainstream media, do you least care for, and why? Oh boy. So I can start if you want. All right. My biggest one that pops up often has to, and unfortunately is characterized by a rogue character, like the classic legacy rogue, I suppose, from D&D mainstream, who is tricky, mischievous, cares only about themselves, and will steal from party members. And we'll just think, oh man, the rogue keeps stealing from the paladin, or the rogue keeps stealing from us, or they keep looting. They're like sneaking into our rooms at night and stealing our stuff. Oh boy, that lovable scamp. It's so annoying. When really what that is it's creating a very antagonistic relationship at the table. And I have a lot of issues with it because in the same way that I don't like rolling for initiative with like PvP. If there is any sort of combat, so to speak, in between people, it's not a match. It's not like a PvP roll initiative, let's go. Unless they both have opted into it. I've had that happen before where two characters like, oh, I want to spar. Hey, can we spar? And they like put their weapons down and they do a fisticuffs and they roll initiative and they describe it, and it's collaborative and consensual. Cool. And it's all fun. But if there's any sort of like, oh, I punch him, it's, do you allow yourself to get hit? Yes or no? Like, I'm not going to have it be a thing. But then we have all these stories that I read from other DMs and other players complaining about the behavior of other characters. And it's like, oh, he rolled a stealth check and he snuck into my room and he stole my prized weapon. And now what do I do about that? And it's like, you can talk to the player and go, I don't like that. Like, that's not cool, bro. And that's why I put it out up front. You will not steal. Like, you're not going to make it a thing where you steal from each other. That is not a quirky thing that you do as a thing. Just don't do it. And the reason is this is a great time when you're going to start breaking apart the boundaries and the personal rapport from player to player. Now there might be moments where, like, gray areas where we agree upon it and it's okay. But to just do it because that's what my character would do, or I'm a rogue, I'm supposed to steal things. I steal from this guy. I use my superior sleight of hand to steal the ancient artifact from the paladin, and I do it in secret, and I send text messages to the DM telling him that I'm doing that. I rolled a natural 20. Look, I rolled a natural 20. I have it now. It's mine. And you as the DM don't have to allow that, and I won't. I'm not going to do that. It's going to be something that there might be distinct moments if we have bought into some sort of scenario where that is allowed, and then everyone knows up front that might happen. But bringing that to the table as, I'm going to steal from everyone. I have been at so many tables where someone will play a rogue and then go, I just steal from him. Oh, I just go into his stuff and I take it. Oh, I take this piece of loot and I hide it from them. Or I betray the party and I just grab the crown and run. Doesn't matter that it sets off a trap and everyone else is going to die. Like, it's that stuff that does come from classic D&D. I think that there's a lot of literature and lore and elements that have brought that into play. But at my tables especially, I have only seen it end poorly. And I have only seen it erode the relationships between the players at the table. Even if the players say, yeah, I'm cool with it, but I've watched it change. The relationship will change, fundamentally change, if you just go, I just steal from him, because it shows a lack of respect for the other person at the table and a lack of respect for their enjoyment. You are effectively you're stealing from them for your enjoyment, which hurts them. And that is not okay with my social contract. So definitely not, you will not steal from the party as your character quirk.
Yeah, and so I think the biggest thing, like you said, the reason why this isn't something we want to encourage is because it's harmful to the fun of the game, right? That most of the time players like it when their characters are quirky, but this is not a quirk that adds value to the relationships. Now, that being said, there are ways to do this so that it adds values to the relationships. So like my mom in Geras wanted to play a kind of archetypal rogue which steals things and sleight of hand checks, but she made it clear that part of the quirk is it's more the process of stealing things. It doesn't matter what it is, you know? So for example, like if I steal an artifact from the paladin, that the paladin would be using mechanically to make them more effective as a combat unit, that's harmful to the party's dynamics. But one of the things she does with her Geras character is that she stole my sister's character's headband, right? So there was like a moment where my sister's character, her hair was in a ponytail and it fell, and she was just like, gotcha, it was a prank, and then she gave it back. Because to her, it wasn't about stealing something, it was about the fun of the prank and the practice, you know? So there are little ways, like you said, it's like a consensual competition where it can be kind of fun just to do the sleight of hand stuff just because it's kind of silly. But there have been times in a game I've run or I've been a part of with you as the DM, Adam, where like a player goes to be like, no, I just want it so I could sell it. And it's like, but my character could be like, I could add value to the party if you let me equip this like necklace we just found that improves my power. And it's like, but I just want more money so I can improve my bow. And it's like, but no, that's not going to be our best investment, like overall as a unit, like thinking in terms of party dynamics versus you as an individual, you know? So I really think it's where it comes from.
Yeah, my final addition with that is when I see it in practice, when it works, it's you put it perfectly well. It's a consensual competition where it's something small that is immediately like rescinded or returned, where it's a cool prank. Okay, I prank them, and that's all I'm doing, and it's something that is considered harmless in a way. And if it is a problem, then it's much more easily addressed. But when I see it erode and destroy, they've stolen something and then they lie about it. Oh, I don't have that. Or, oh, this thing that I took from them, I throw it away. This thing that I took from them, I sell it and I don't tell them. And it's like those little decisions, unless we're in a campaign where we know that's coming, it's always bad because it's no longer innocent. It's very antagonistic. And then you haven't built a team player. You haven't built a person that's there to be an adventurer. You made only a thief, and that's all they'll be.
Yeah, and with player versus player anything, in D&D, I kind of just classify it as combat because it's antagonistic usually. It's a little bit inherently just not a fun experience at the table. And I've actually had players come up to me and say, when we're starting a campaign, they'll say, I want to make sure that everybody's going to be friends after this. And to me, that's actually something pretty scary to hear from a player, because it implies that they've had experiences where D&D has just turned into like an all-out shouting match or something like that, or where it just disbands, the party disbands. Like they don't even get the quest, they start a bar fight or whatever, and if you're at the tavern, classic, start a bar fight and you all hate each other at the end. And it makes me upset because I am not trying to create an experience where people feel like they're under attack or they feel like their player character is under attack. So my biggest, it's not my pet peeve, my other pet peeve, this is the least the common trope that I despise, is when players work against each other, just with malicious intent, I guess you could say. Yeah, that's kind of it. It's you guys have said most of it, but it's it's never going to turn out well. And as you know, it's in my nature to want to de-escalate situations and keep things flowing smoothly. So whenever I say, we'll just take an example, somebody is playing a gnome in one of my campaigns and the other one's playing a Goliath. The Goliath picks up the gnome and like just kind of like holds them there, like preventing the gnome from running away from a scenario which might be dangerous because they're about to enter combat. And the gnome player starts getting kind of, you know, agitated because it's like, well, I tried to warn you guys that there was something really big and dangerous coming and you guys should have just listened to me and we should have run away. And the Goliath's like, "Der Goliath." And it was kind of funny, but I had to be really careful with that situation because I didn't want them to suddenly feel like they were against each other, especially when I had some sort of combat planned. So the way it worked out was more like the thing shows up, the Goliath puts the gnome down, and the gnome's like, well, it's here now, so I guess we'll have to take care of it. And they ended up working together. So yeah, it's just important to me that we all remember, you know, the core of what this game is about, which is just having fun together and not being, you know, antagonistic towards each other.
Yeah, just on the PvP thing, I think really you have to look at what, like Adam said, what is the core of the PvP? Is it two characters are trying to outperform each other, or is there a story thing? Like I remember in Grey Owls, Gavin tried to hit Solomon because Solomon said something that made him mad. But Solomon's a better fighter, so he caught his foot. And there was a minor, like usually PvP, if you can resolve it with a skill challenge instead of like damage, like that's when characters get damaged, that's like where you cross the boundary. But yeah, so my the one thing, and again, this was a community thing. What trope or scenario do I least care for? It's the idea that the goal is to outsmart the DM. Or the DM is trying to outsmart the players. And I mean, like with stealing from the party, this is something that's in Dungeons and Dragons' DNA from the beginning. It's not something we have to adhere to, but there are stories of Gary Gygax specifically setting up players to like compete against each other. Or it's basically not what your character would do in a certain circumstance, but as a player, are you smart enough to overcome the dungeon I've elaborately set up? So a lot of times I see this where it's like, oh, let's try to mess with the DM, or let's see if we can break their encounter, you know? And that's not the goal of the game. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a component of it. There have been times I've been outsmarted as a DM, or a player goes to use a spell and I'm like, well, guess the encounter's done. But it's not one of these things where I'm like mad about it, or I'm somehow trying to one up the players, you know? Or I'm trying to keep them from breaking my encounter because for story reasons, that should be, you know, I just don't like that idea where it destroys the partnership, you know? And it also doesn't mean the DM shouldn't set up challenges or anything like that. It's just the DM isn't there to be outsmarted. The players aren't there to be outsmarted. It's sometimes you get a surprise and that's really exciting and energizing, but what's the goal of the game? You know, the goal isn't to outsmart the DM. The goal is to have fun and role play and storytell, you know? So the next question we have is, what is the most profound idea you've come up with, or just one that you like, throughout our first 100 episodes of Shower Thoughts, or our first 99 episodes?
So I'll just jump right in. It's establishing expectations right up front. And this is, you often get this lesson right when it's your session 0. And I'm finding that every couple of sessions, and for some groups, even just right at the beginning of every session. And it can be really casual. It can be formal the first time, and then it's not even like a, hey guys, just a reminder, because then it doesn't come off as scolding. It's just a, man, I really enjoy that we're really story driven, and you really have bought into this cooperative narrative experience, even if combat can get a little wonky. It's celebrating while also reestablishing those expectations. And then any one shot I run, by putting out there, yes, this is like D&D 5e, but these are the things that have changed, and this is the type of experience that it's really lends well to. Every session that I do that in, that is one of the best sessions in that scenario or that game or that one shot or that system. It is hands above every other time that I've gone like, okay, let's go, without first taking a moment and establishing this is how this game works, and these are the elements that change, and that's that. And it synergizes the whole expectations.
So I think the one thought that kind of ties everything back together is, as the dungeon master, how you choose to resolve things mechanically is going to encourage or discourage certain habits in your players. So for example, if your player tries something creative and all you do is resolve it flavorfully, but you don't change how you mechanically rule it, they're not going to try to change their flavor. They're going to just go with what's written, you know? If you set armor class too low, that's going to encourage certain builds. If you set armor class too high, that's going to encourage certain builds, you know? If you make your encounters too tough combat-wise, you're going to encourage players to optimize their characters, which means you're going to see a lot of the same characters show up, even if their personalities are a little different. You're not going to see a wide variety of builds. If you make your encounters like there's too many like legendary resistances, you're going to get players that don't use any debuff spells because they're not going to work, you know? So it's how you choose to rule things mechanically will encourage players to bring certain characters to your table. If you run games with not a lot of combat, they won't bring characters that are only focused on combat, you know? They'll bring characters that are going to be effective with the games that you tend to run. And a lot of times, if you realize this, you're going to have to allow for like a transition period, probably about 6 months, because your players will get used to the habits that you were doing. It'll take them time to get used to the games that you're now running. And just personally, what I found is, because that was more like a D&D specific thing, just for personal growth and development, I have had a profound amount of benefit by finding ways to use the words recognize and value just in my language. So rather than reflect, you know, using the term recognize, because you can recognize it after the fact, you can recognize it in the moment, or you can recognize what it's going to be, you know, further down the road. That term recognize and value is the other one. So things aren't important, things have value. And what that allows you to do is determine how much value it has right now, or how much value it will have in the future, or how much value it did have, but it doesn't have as much value now, you know? A really good example is ruling things rules as written. That had a lot of value when I did it and I was strict on it, because it allowed players to trust me, you know? But now it has a lot less value because we're running story-based games. We're not running teaching the rules-based games, you know? I have my set of players that have kind of like grown up with me, you know, they've gotten used to my style. Now I can trust them with homebrew rules so that we can have a more story intensive experience. So it ties back to D&D, but just in my personal life, using the word recognize and value has had the most profound benefits.
So for me, I would say that the most profound idea that I've come up with was more of, it wasn't so much an idea, it was more of an acceptance about what a story entails and what a compelling story becomes when you allow yourself to be open to the possibilities. The possibility in this case is actually player character death. So I am heavily invested in all of the characters that I play, and that's something that I value greatly because it's what creates the best story and contributes to the narrative that the DM is trying to tell. But I am also accepting of the fact that sometimes my character might not just make it. And that can happen. And that can lead to more story things. Like, that's not necessarily the end of it's not the end of my player character, because the DM has the power to maybe call an ex machina, but the ex machina have to be like, you know, just something cliche or whatever. Like, oh, you just don't die, or the hand of God reaches down and life flows through you. And it's like, well, no, what based on my character so far could be used in a scenario to tell a story where maybe you don't permanently die. Maybe you're out of the fight for a while, but they take you back to the hospital or whatever, and start, you know, doing I say hospital, take it back to the sanctuary or something, and start doing something to bring you back. Or they start casting resurrection or something like that. Another cool one is with wild magic, for example. There's actually a wild magic option where you can be reincarnated if you die within the next minute. And that's a really cool, storytelling option. You may have been a half-elf before, but now you've turned into a genasi or something like that. And I think those are really interesting because it shows the value of a player character, both in life and in their death, and what kind of legacy they're leaving behind. And so for me, that's what the most profound thing is that just because your character dies doesn't mean it's the end. And if they do die, then how can you turn that into a narrative exit? So this one's pretty easy. What are you guys still figuring out after 99 episodes of DM Shower Thoughts?
For me, it's just marketing and reach. Just getting the most amount of viewers we can. We are taking steps to try to do that, but it's still a process we're figuring out. And I think that we have a lot of valuable ideas to share. So it's just finding ways to share them. So if you're listening to this podcast, share it with a D&D person that you know.
For me, it is just balancing life and production. I have a lot of vested interests in the podcast and the blog and all the things in my painting. And sometimes I'll go through stints of my life where everything fits in easily into a schedule and I'm working just fine. And then it's like one thing gets thrown out of whack and I have a hard time readjusting. I have a longer period where I really just have to recalibrate everything and then I get back into it. It seems like lately those things have been being harder and harder to balance work and life and needing to recharge, but then I still have deadlines for myself. So I'm working on it, but it's getting better.
Yeah, especially with, COVID still happening in your profession, I can imagine. For me, the thing that I'm still trying to figure out is how not to say the word every time I speak. It's a little difficult because I want to sound coherent and I want to have fluid thoughts, be, produced from my mouth hole. But it's also just in my nature. I think I'm a little bit of a hesitant kind of guy. So whenever I, whenever I pause or say, it's usually me trying to collect my thoughts so that I can actually say something that makes sense. Because I have a tendency of just garbling and stuff. It just doesn't make sense all the time. So I try to give myself the space to be able to say, proper sentences and all that. I think it's actually a lot harder when you're bilingual too, because there's just so many more options at that point.
And we have it's also going on with the last 99 episodes. Is there anyone or anyone you would like to thank for being a part of our first 99 episodes?
Yeah, I'd like to thank Ian for being an awesome conversationalist, someone to bounce ideas off of. Definitely you, Adam, for not only really like kickstarting a lot of this like D&D stuff and just it's had such value in my life that it's heartfelt thank you. And for producing and editing all of our content. And the last one is just, it sounds kind of hokey, but to our listeners, especially for the ones that engage with us regularly, I can't name everybody because there's a few of you guys, but just everybody that like submitted questions that just showed us like you're willing to engage and you're willing to be a part of the conversation that we have about D&D and how it can add value to people's lives.
So in addition to all our listeners and my lovely co-hosts, I would like to thank all of the other podcasters and YouTubers out there who provide lots of inspiration for me as a content creator, at least a part of the content creating process. And I really think that without being able to see the rise of these people to the level that they are now over time, it would be very difficult to have hope basically for expanding our reach and meeting new people, really, because the anonymity of the internet makes things a little bit scary sometimes, because people will say things they might not normally say in person, or you're under a lot of harsh judgment sometimes when you put yourself out there. I mean, just look at a lot of people who gain the attention of the media in a negative light. You know, you see them get like, I'm not saying this would ever happen to us, but like you see them get like death threats and stuff. And it's like, oh my God, that's so scary. I can't even imagine that happening to me. It would be absolutely devastating. But also keeping in mind that this is kind of like a passion project for me. I don't expect to get paid. I don't expect to make it big or whatever, but I'm excited about the possibilities that it opens. So thank you for everyone else who's succeeded in this and paving the road for, smaller content creators like us.
And I would like to thank, of course, my awesome co-hosts, but especially John, for always having a perspective that is either different from my own or one that I just haven't considered. And often especially nowadays, we can kind of surround ourselves with people that think the same as us, and we live in echo chambers. But John, despite us having similar interests, the way he communicates can sometimes be different than how I communicate. And I think having conversations with people that communicate differently than you has great value. And his input has had a tremendous value to my life. So in starting this podcast, it was really just a means for us to chat about D&D and try to add value by conversing together and considering each other's viewpoints and analysis together, which has been tremendously and exponentially valuable moving forward. And then I got two shout outs. Both these people are listeners and they've worked with us. One is Chelsea Cottle of C Cottle Art, who has done our art for the podcast itself, and will be doing some more work for us very soon. And she's played in our games and is also now has taken on an apprenticeship role with me, and is running one of her campaigns with me, and that also has been really valuable to just see how another person is running a game, but running a game from the very beginning of their DMing, and who has a very different style than some of the other people I've got. And then to Matt. And Matt is a player that's gone in a couple of our games. I don't think he's actually played with Ian yet. But he is a player that has a long legacy of Dungeons and Dragons in his life. Used to play it old school and now has been playing it with all of us. And he's always down to try out things. So he's play testing. He's always down to play test my weird content. Play testing something in Grey Owls. He's going to play test something else soon. He's always there with great beta testing and wonderful viewpoints and great enthusiasm at the table. I feel like I could throw almost anything at him and he would go, cool, and make it fun somehow. And it's that sort of perspective and modeling that I look at him and go, yeah, just come to any table. I think that'd be great. But it provides perspective and allowance for me to homebrew and to sort of test things out, knowing that especially him and players like him will take that and be reflective on it. They'll test it out and go, I wonder if it would work better with this, because this is what happened when I did it. Instead of going, this is dumb and I don't think you should do it. It's here, let me try it out. Okay, and then they will very gently give whatever their feedback is, and we have a discussion, a discourse to move forward. And it's just a great example of a level of play, which I really appreciated. So for all of his discussions with me to make my content better, it's been highly beneficial. So thank you, Matt.
All right, so our last question, the one to rule them all, and to kind of wrap this up for today. If you were to go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice before your first session that you DM'd, what would that piece of advice be?
Start small. I often go all in, and it's nice to have the grand story of everything, and that's great for a campaign setting, and you can do all of that. But the idea that, and you can go in with a full framework of the worldview and its history and all that deep lore can still happen. And I'm not saying don't do that. However, my first session of D&D, I had huge expectations for how things were going to go and where the players were going to go. And I didn't prepare the smaller, intimate things that they could interact with, which is, hey, what does the tavern keep look like? Who else is in the tavern? What does the blacksmith look like? How does the blacksmith sound? What's the one person in that house over there? You know, just little things of the city that they're in, or the small setting where they start. Because what I'm doing then is I'm giving them things to interact with. That's all. So start smaller, prepare things for players to interact with. And that can tie into your big grand story, but the idea is by preparing more things for them to interact with, that's when you get to see who the players are and who the characters are. That's when the magic happens, because you give them some, here's the thing, and then they interact with it. And now you start to see immediately how this is going to go, rather than worrying about, are they ever going to make it to the main plot? This is the plot. This is it. Here we are. And you get to see what they're interested in just by giving those little things to interact with right in the beginning. You can still have all that world building. It's just when you're trying to make a game experience from the start, it was a good reminder to me that I can build little things for people to interact with. And that's where the fun comes out. That's where it's sort of this effervescent possibilities that come out.
Yeah, I would say I used to be a really bad DM in that, like, I used to have scripts for my players based on the characters that they gave me, that basically, like, your character said this, now your character said this, now you can interact because of that. So I would say first, if you can, play in somebody else's game first. Have somebody else DM for you, get a sense of what the flow of the game feels like, and get a sense for just letting go of control, so that way your players can have the chance to surprise you. And then you don't have to plan everything out exactly. You can, like, exploring ideas and seeing where it goes is part of the fun. So, like, it doesn't, like you can start with a one-shot adventure, you know, with a beginning, middle, and end. Then if the players like their characters enough, you can see what their next one-shot adventure is until you unveil a grander plot. But it doesn't have to be a grand, epic thing that you hear about as a trope, you know? Sometimes it's just an adventure, you know?
So for me, when I started DMing, I began with the Curse of Strahd module, and I read through the book. Well, I didn't read through all of it, but I read through a fair amount of it, and I knew what the story was. And for me, I was excited because I wanted to share that story with my players, and I wanted to see what they would think of it. But that's different than playing D&D and DMing, because in DMing, like you guys say, there's a lot of, you know, room for error, and it's not always about the overarching plot. It's about what the players do with the setting that they're put in. And for me, the lesson there was that instead of being concerned about continuity or something, or, you know, consistency, getting progression through the story and getting them the information that they need to understand what's going on, which is, you know, fine too, but it's about giving myself leeway in changing the story and maybe even the setting. You know, like with Curse of Strahd, Mother Night, Morning Lord, you know, there's not a lot to go on. So I'm left to come up with something myself, and that's great. I think that was the right mindset to have. And so I'm looking forward to continuing Curse of Strahd with that mindset in hand, and hopefully continuing with both groups that are doing it. The other thing is that I think yes and has been a pretty good theme for me this year, that I should be open to accepting what my players are trying to accomplish and telling them what happens afterwards and sticking with it, really, because I don't like retconning too hard. There's some moments where it's like, well, I wish I kind of cast Mage Armor, and I'm like, I'll let you have done that. But then there's other things where it's like, well, now knowing how that interaction was going to play out, I kind of wish I hadn't done that. Well, I'm not going to retcon that whole thing. So there's a lot of value in the yes and phrase, because it's not only expanding the possibilities of what can happen, but it's also allowing it to be a dynamic between the DM and the player as to how things are going to play out. So they come up with the scenario, I say, yes, that's what happens, and here's what happens that you didn't think of, because I'm the DM and I think this would be pretty cool if it did happen. So not just like trying to screw them over or whatever, but yeah, I think it's a really cool mentality to have. So that's what I would say to myself.
And that does it for our fan questions, at least for now. In our episode 101. Here's to another 100 episodes, I hope. Well done, everybody. And some really big things coming up on the horizon, which I'll tell you more about next episode. But thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. You can find our YouTube channel, DM Shower Thoughts, over on YouTube. Now featuring maybe some videos by Ian. And I'll be producing a couple pretty soon as my life acclimates just a bit more. The podcast goes up just about every Friday, maybe retroactively, but every Friday on Podbean at noon. And we are now on Spotify and iTunes. If you search for DM Shower Thoughts, it'll pop up and you'll see the icon. And you can follow us there and listen to us there if that's how you'd like to consume the media. Yes, indeed. And you can also find blog posts from John's study hall, or sometimes notes from The Apprentice for Ian, and then my GM's corner. And those go up. My blog post will be every Saturday, and then the study halls are either every other Wednesday. And then I've got miniature posts and other things from Moon River that go up too. So there's lots of content that gets produced on the website, which is adamsdrakeproductions.com. All right. And that's our handles. And you can also find DM Shower Thoughts on Facebook. So everybody, have a wonderful day. And please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.
I think the core of Dungeons & Dragons is puzzle and encounter design. I'll draw from favorite movies, video games, books, anything to create a one-of-a-kind play experience. When you start with a solid framework, all you need is to grab your best friends and hilarity ensues naturally. I'm Sully, Dungeon Master and host of the podcast How Friends Roll, a 5th edition actual play podcast of micro-campaigns featuring a rotating cast of characters. Come join our table. How Friends Roll is available wherever you get your podcasts.